Okay.
Director Wyrick,
Yeah, here.
Director Daddy,
Here.
Director Silke,
Here.
and Chair Hedges.
Here.
Thank you.
I'm not used to being called first with a last name beginning in W, so.
Enjoy it while you can, Bill.
Yeah.
Okay, the next item is director comments, reports. Peter, you have anything on the mutuals?
Nothing happening out this way.
Okay. Bill, the city of Ojai.
No, it's only tangentially of interest, but we did submit a query letter regarding the change in the reclaimed final surface plan that the county is considering for the quarry of deleting the need for 97,000 cubic yards of fill. We also are joining Forest Watch and Sierra Club in objecting to the process that the county is using for approving that. It does affect the watershed, obviously does not affect OBGMA, but I just thought it might be of interest.
Anything else? Bob?
No, nothing. I mean, it was kind of interesting as Mosler had over a dozen years ago asked to be able to mine Matilaha and mine the fines out. And I think it would be interesting if he would just take the stuff, the silt out of the dam and truck it across the street instead of tens of thousands of trucks, bringing in material from outside when it's available right across the street. And evidently there aren't any environmental issues with Matilaha if they're willing to take it down. So, I'm pretty sure whatever they come up with, it'll be so far from what I think the solution will be. It'll be, pretty amazing. So just watch it. Interesting.
Okay, Jim, welcome.
Thank you. Sorry.
All right.
A little more traffic out there that I didn't expect.
Yeah. I'll bet.
My wife spent an hour and a half going to an appointment in Ventura mid-morning.
Yeah.
You have anything to report, Jim?
No, I do not. Since our last meeting.
Ian Casitas, I don't have anything particular to report.
You have a new board member.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's, Mary Bergen was appointed to the board on last night. Well, actually, she was elected on Friday, but made her formal appointment last night. So it's nice to have her back. I think she's probably someone that's very supportive of the Ojai Basin and the issues we're dealing with. Okay, if there's nothing else from the board, general manager comments.
I don't have any comments today.
Hey, are there any comments from the public on items that are not on our agenda today? If so, if you will either indicate through the chat or however it's done. I don't see anyone. Okay, I don't hear any comments. The next item is the consent agenda, approval of the minutes of April 29th.
We skipped over the basin status report.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Do you really want to hear it?
And I think that's the report.
It didn't go up. We can assume it didn't go up.
Well, let's talk some interesting stuff, shall we? Let's see, where are we? All right. So can everybody see this today?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
And although it's the end of May, today's talk we're going to call June being busting out all over, because it certainly has felt like summer for a while. And as we all know, we're not really seeing the effects of winter or even spring for that matter, like we have this time in previous years. And in fact, once upon a time, we were of the mindset, oh, April, May, that's when everything's peaking around the basin. And by June, by the June meeting, we'd be able to say what the basin conditions were and how much water was in the basin in storage and how much folks should be conserving versus using and establishing the amounts of anticipated import and groundwater pumpage for various folks. But every year is different, and this year's no different in that it is different. We're still, not a lot of rain since then, just 4 less than 5 inches on the valley floor, upwards of 7 on the ridge tops. Again, lowest since 1947. I don't expect that to be much better as we get toward the end of the water year, September 30th. Where that's going and how we're monitoring it via the number of wells in the basin that we have loggers in or have had loggers in, and of course the discharge point where the San Antonio Creek exits the basin. Within the Elrod well, you can see that over the years we've monitored continuing trends, very parallel tracks really. During this particular download, we noticed that the well was actually pumping. So what we report today is slightly before that pumping, that just the peak in water level just before that pumping began a couple of days back. What's interesting is that you'll note when the water levels are lower there in 2017 and 18, each of those downward spikes in this comb are water levels during pumping conditions. And the deeper the water levels are, the more drawdown this individual well exhibits during a normal pumping cycle. The same is true for most any well within the basin, but you'll notice in 2019 and 20, when water levels are much shallower, that drawdown was much less, indicating a more transmissive aquifer as it's been greater saturated thickness and more available drawdown and things of that nature. And right now, we're right in the middle of that, where we're starting to see an increase in drawdown during pumping cycles. So this is something we'd expect over the course of this coming year in all wells in the basin, really, decreased efficiency effectively. And that can lead to issues like sanding and some other problems that wells will tend to have. So let's be aware of that as pumping constituents. Over the longer haul, here's where we're at. On May 23rd, which is the peak just before that pumping cycle, we're at 153.71 feet below ground surface, roughly at the top of the casing there, or the basin at about 70% capacity with some 56,000 acre feet in storage. We're about 13 feet off our annual high thus far. That would have been just before Valentine's Day 2021, which was a very modest 6-foot rise from just 5 weeks or 6 weeks previous at the end of December. All right, so as we go to the discharge side in San Antonio Creek, we monitor the first daylighting groundwater. And what we notice is that there are certain times of the year where it's very consistent at the same level before a marked drop occurs and the water starts daylighting much down gradient. In this case, on the left is where our GPS is mapping the daylighting groundwater last month and then this month. You can see we're almost in the same rush of reeds. And of course, on the more flowing side, this is the view underneath Creek Road, just near the Montgomery Drain. This is from March. There's April. In fact, let me go back so you know what you're looking at here. This is from March, a little bit more flow, and then April. Any guesses as to what we see in the next image?
Right.
Yeah. Those who said dry, you win a prize. And the prize is being able to walk the creek without getting wet. But this is just draining the city portion. On the main stem of San Antonio Creek, we still have quite a bit of flow. Again, here's March, progressing to April, and then this week. Looks very similar, actually. Flow within this portion of the creek, just downstream from the basin outflow point. This is the 25th of May, just a couple days back. There still is plenty of water present there. It's not flowing as much. It's not dry, certainly, and it probably will get drier as we approach October and November of this year. But nevertheless, there is flow into this portion of San Antonio Creek from the Ojai Basin. Granted, it's from the perched aquifers. We see the declines in the water levels in the Key Well and the basin production aquifers. But the key is that through this point, there still is water flowing. And we clear this portion of the foliage there to make room for our transect line from which we measure the flow. And the reason I bring this up is because if there is to be some solution to a habitat issue, there's an inflow of water to this portion of San Antonio Creek, which means that pools could be constructed or summering pools could be maintained such that water would be present for species that may be dependent on water, especially some of the vertebrates. But let's talk about that in a sec. What do the numbers mean? So on the 25th of May, we were down to 0.22 CFS flowing across that section. That's a pretty still pool in that area. Montgomery Creek, zero flow whatsoever. And we brought down our range to 15 acre feet per month discharge of surface flow, ranging up to 45 at the highest time that we measured this. And our water year to date is 253 acre feet flowing out. And those are snapshot measurements and measured on average. And we do have the logger within the creek itself that indicates on a much more rapid basis the stage fluctuations of flow. And we're going to probably change that a little bit going forward as it gets drier and we get a bit more of a channelization to where the incised bedrock is the only point of flow on San Antonio Creek there. Nevertheless, there are a couple of macrovertebrates that you can see if you look really closely in this image from the other day. It's good to see this. Even during dry times, even during drought years or nascent drought years, you can see these fauna, emphasis on fawn, enjoying the phreatophytic plants that are growing effectively out of the saturated San Antonio Creek alluvium. This is a little downstream from the basin boundary, but these two deer are certainly enjoying what's going on near Camp Comfort. But as you go further down San Antonio Creek, conditions, of course, get drier. And this is looking upstream from Old Creek Road Bridge, just above the confluence with the Upper Ventura River Basin. And clearly it's a dry run here on surface. That is alluvium. It's a very narrow swath of alluvium. And there most certainly is water flowing underneath that alluvium, as you can see in the upper portion of the creek in this image, that there is water standing just before it fully percolates or fully infiltrates back into the subsurface and flows down the known and defined channel that is San Antonio Creek in this area. So there you go. I'm happy to answer any questions. We, of course, have other things to discuss throughout the other agenda items. So any questions, happy to take them now.
Any questions? Okay, thanks, Jordan.
All right, thank you.
Move to the consent item, approval of the minutes. If I can have a motion
So moved.
Second.
and call the roll.
Director Finch,
Yes.
Director Wyrick,
Yes.
Director Daddy,
Yes.
Director Stilkey,
Yes.
and Chair Hages.
Yes.
Unanimous. Thank you.
Item 8A is the treasurer's report for April. John?
I'll just give a little better review than I've given in the past. Beginning bank balances were about $169,213. We had an income of a little over $45,000. Expenses were at $13,791. We also had the refund to San Antonio Creek Ranch of $12,775. The ending balance was $168,098. So we had a decline of our bank balance by $1,114. The disbursement register shows we spent $44,842. That's pretty much the expenditure side and the budget side. The one thing I wanted to share was, I don't know how many of you understood what I tried to do, but on the extraction statement, I know Director Wyrick had a question back in January with the 2018-19 water year, where it said we had 2,800, I think, for the year. And we went back and looked at that, and that wasn't correct. And so we've corrected that. And it should have been 4,600 acre feet that was in that particular water year. So the statement, the future statements all reflect that. And there was a database problem, so we got that corrected and have corrected that report. Let's see what else. No changes in the grant income at this point. We expect we'll see much more revenue coming from that once the nested monitoring well is constructed, and then we submit a request for reimbursement on that project. So that's all I have on the treasurer's report.
Any questions? Okay, if there's no questions, can I have a motion to accept the report?
So moved, Jim.
Second, Warwick. All right, let Bob do it. Yeah.
Okay, Director Finch,
Yes.
Director Wyrick,
Yes.
Director Daddy,
Yes.
Director Fielke,
Yes.
and Chair Hedges.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, the next item is a report on the progress on the nested monitoring well. Jordan?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we could probably both take this. We're still in the process of preparing for the drilling. It's planned for June 8th to begin. This is right on the Fulton Street demonstration area, very near the old OBGMA offices. We're having ABC Leoven do this drilling. I just worked with them on a project this past week, and they've got top-notch equipment. It's really nice to see that, because so many drillers don't necessarily invest in their own equipment, but these guys certainly have, and it's a very clean operation. I think you'll be impressed if you get a chance to come by and see it. We've got pretty much all the autographs we need. A little bit of permit fees that we still need to pay to the city for the encroachment permit, and then the county for the actual monitoring well permit. But we have all the autographs on that we need, so it's a matter of relatively quick paperwork to make that happen. But we're looking forward to drilling, and should be this time next month. We have cores to share and quite a bit more information. And we'll probably, if you want to stop by and check it out, bring a hard hat, steel-toed boots. More than welcome to. We'll keep you posted on that progress.
Jordan, you think you put out a little email out when you're going to start operations?
Yeah,
Maybe?
yeah, we will. Yeah, and when the cores are laid out, it's pretty interesting to see. So that's part of the most exciting part to be able to witness, and then a lot of the rest is, well, it's a construction project. Other than that, but happy to share the exciting parts, especially as we come across some of the lacustrine clays and fossils that we expect to see from some of the bugs that may have been crawling around the lake bottom in the latest Pleistocene.
I'm looking forward to that, although I do not own a pair of steel-toed shoes, so I guess I'll have to go invest in a pair somewhere.
Or maybe we just make you stand on the east side of the street. Yeah. That's safe enough too.
You're definitely a geologist.
Yeah, born and raised.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you, Jordan.
All right, thank you.
Next item is an update on the groundwater model.
Yeah, Trey, go ahead, Trey.
Good afternoon, Chair Hedges. Today's meeting is going to be a little bit of errata from the last meeting. We did get in touch with Daniel B. Stevens. We were able to collaborate with them, and we now have got the groundwater model working. So today, my colleague Trevor Jones is going to provide an update on the revised findings to the groundwater model. And then when Trevor starts sharing screen here, we also have a brief presentation on groundwater dependent ecosystems to follow Trevor's talk.
Okay.
Take it away, Trevor.
All right, thank you, Trey. Can you guys all see my screen okay and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. So, yeah, as Trey mentioned, today we're going to be discussing a little bit of an update to the water budgets that we were preparing for the GSP using the groundwater model developed by Daniel B. Stevens. Again, as Trey mentioned, it's kind of a little bit of a correction and a revision to what we presented in the last month. And we're going to walk through what we discussed with Daniel B. Stevens and kind of how they guided our analysis, and then where we're going to be at for the GSP water budget development, and then moving into the projected simulations that we're going to discuss as well. So just a little overview about where we're going to be going. I'm going to give a short overview of what we presented last month. So in terms of what we were extracting from the numerical model, how we were comparing it to observations collected in the basin and data collected in the basin, and how we were letting that inform its use for the GSP. Then I'm going to go into our discussion that we had a little bit with DB Stevens, how they've suggested the refinement of our analysis, and then how that then reinforms the use of the use and the suitability of the model for the GSP. And then some proposed methods that we're going to discuss for developing projected water budgets as a requirement to satisfy the GSP's projected conditions section of the report or the plan. So to start off, I'm going to show the same graphic that we presented last month that just kind of was informing our interpretation of the model. Here, what I'm showing are two key components of what that information was. The first is we have measured groundwater elevations that are shown in the chart on the left. These different groundwater elevations are measured across the basin, and their spatial location match the color coding of the water levels collected and shown in the graph. So we have in this dark purple line is 12HO2, corresponds to groundwater elevations measured in the southwestern portion of the basin. As we move north through the central axis of the basin, we have O5, L8, and then up in the northeastern and eastern portion of the basin. And what the water levels were showing us were relatively stable groundwater elevations that were indicative of some declines during drought periods and then rebounds during wet periods. Now, the second piece of information that this graph provides is our original interpretation of the model results. And those interpretations and what the model results were showing us are shown here in this black cumulative change in storage curve that starts right around a couple thousand feet above zero, I think about 2,000 acre feet of increase in storage in water year 1971, down to a cumulative decline in groundwater storage in 2019 of around almost 30,000 acre feet or so. And what the results were telling us was that the model was saying we're losing about 625 acre feet per year of groundwater and storage. And when we looked at that compared to the groundwater elevation measurements, the two weren't really jiving, and we were kind of coming to the conclusion that there's something that we're missing here. So as Trey mentioned, we got in contact with DB Stevens and they scheduled a meeting where we could collaborate on and discuss how we were interpreting the results. And DB Stevens pointed out that there are two different output files that were provided. The first was an output file that specified the rate at which groundwater and storage changes at each quarter in the simulated period, and the second that specifies the total volume of groundwater storage change at the end of each stress period in the model. What we were originally using to produce this black curve here is that output file that specifies the rate. So the rate would be like an acre foot per day change in groundwater storage. We then took that rate and converted it into a total volume by multiplying the rate by the duration of the quarter that the model was simulating over to produce this black curve here. DB Stevens noted that the rates that groundwater and storage change within the model, they change at a faster rate than the output of the quarterly output. So say the simulation is simulating something for a 3-month period. The rates at which storage change within that 3-month period is actually going to be faster than just the average rate or the rate at the end of the simulation period. So they suggested using this output file that explicitly wrote the total volume of storage change within the given period. So we went back to the drawing board based on their suggestions and recalculated the model water budgets. And the results from that new analysis using the output file that DB Stevens suggested using is shown here in the figure on the left. So again, we've got the same groundwater elevations that we're showing across the basin from the southwestern corner to the northeastern corner. The same trends that we've discussed. We have some periods of decline during drought, but then rebounds during wet periods and overall stability. Now, what the black curve is showing is the same cumulative change in storage that's output from the Ojai Basin groundwater model. But the way that the cumulative change in storage is calculated is now different than what we presented the last period. Again, the last period, we used one file. DB Stevens suggested using the secondary output file. And using that secondary output file, we were able to produce this black curve that's shown here. And what the black curve tells us now, the cumulative change in storage matches what's happening and what we're observing in terms of groundwater elevation changes relatively well. Here, again, if we look specifically at well 5LO8, and that's noted here with these red markers and represents groundwater elevations measured in the central portion of the basin. We have relatively stable groundwater elevations. There's a little bit of a decline from 1978 through 1991. That's reflected in the cumulative change in storage curve where we have a high in the late 70s and a decline in groundwater storage through 1990-ish. Then there's a period in the groundwater elevations where groundwater elevations rise. That's reflected again in the cumulative change in storage. And then it's relatively stable until we get to the recent drought where we see groundwater elevations decline, cumulative change in storage decline, and then a rebound in cumulative change in storage that reflects the rebound observed in groundwater elevations. So what we get from this updated analysis is that the model is telling us that storage is changing at around 15 acre-feet per year, or a decline of 15 acre-feet per year, which is really indicating that the model is telling us the basin's in balance, right? That 15 acre-feet per year, as I'm going to discuss next, is well within the model uncertainty, and it's just a reflection that operations and management and use of groundwater in the basin has historically been in balance with how the quantity at which the basin's recharged throughout the 1971 to 2019 period. So
I would like to compliment you here because I think I raised the real question, or first to raise the real question last time. And this graphically looks like it makes sense. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. And we appreciate the DB Stevens team help with this. I mean, it was really valuable input that they provided that allowed us to reassess and reevaluate this water budget and use the model that's been developed for the basin for the GSP. So
well, the thing that's nice about this, that Jordan has been telling the board for years that the basin essentially recovers quickly and generally in balance. And now he got something that really puts it on paper and justifies those comments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wonderful. I wish the California Department of Fish and Wildlife would be so responsive to the reality of data collection.
Yeah, agreed.
And then Trevor, this change in storage of approximately 15 acre-feet per year decline, that essentially matches what DB Stevens reported in their model report. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Trevor, quick other question. Is there any change in the rate of rebound as a function of precipitation falling over time? Is that stable?
So that's a good question. So I'm going to get into a slide next that shows the volume of precipitation recharge that shows the variability in that. That may get to your question, but are you asking if say under the same volume of precipitation if the rate that it were recharged changes throughout the historical period? Is that?
Yes, that's what I was asking.
I'm not sure. I haven't I haven't dived into the material at that level of detail yet to see if that's what we're observing.
It's just curious, that's all.
Yeah, I think that's a good question.
And what I have in mind is whether that be a way of measuring the success of the Ojai Valley Sanitary District in reducing infiltration into the sewer system over time. But it may not be something that's of order of magnitude that can be measured, but I just was wondering.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it's a good question. So
I have a question. Since it's it's a relatively short period of time, and the record ends with a relatively severe drought.
Yes.
So if that drought hadn't occurred, or if it was more moderate, the basin could show a gain instead of a loss. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key here too with this rebound is that when we look at pumping was down in this period in the drought, which allowed water to rebound. But if we're in a wet period, I think what the model is going to tell us is that the basin's going to rebound and we'd have a gain in storage for sure.
And then also, Chair Hedges, towards the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about the future simulations and the historical period of record that we're proposing to run. And we also would like to get input from the board and stakeholders on that period, which will inform the future simulations.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so kind of building off that now, I want to go into a little bit of what we're going to be able to present for the GSP using these model results, the resolution of what the model is going to tell us and what those kind of chunks of the model outputs, what they represent in reality. So again, I'm going to bring us back to this hydrogeologic conceptual model that I've harped on now in the last presentation, has been presented before, but I think again gives a nice overview of the different ways that the basin is stressed at different rates and different locations. So I'm going to start with inflows to the groundwater system. I'm going to talk about how the model represents it and what we can extract from the model. Then I'll move to the outflows from the groundwater or from the groundwater basin, how the model represents those and how we can extract them from the model as well. So first, starting at inflows, we've got kind of this component of distributed recharge. We have precipitation that falls on the valley floor. Some of that's going to make its way through the rooting zone and recharge the basin. In addition to that, we have irrigation return flows, so water that's applied on land surface. Some of that's going to get consumed by the crops that it's irrigating. Some of it's going to make its way past the rooting zone and contribute to recharge to the basin. These two components of recharge are computed by the distributed parameter watershed model that was developed by D.B. Stevens. And again, that's a model that's decoupled from the groundwater model domain. So the way that the numerical model works is we run a watershed model. From that watershed model, we extract out these recharge components and feed them into the groundwater model, which then simulates groundwater changes in storage and changes in groundwater elevations over time. So in terms of how that's represented as an input into the model, precipitation recharge and irrigation return flows are lumped into a single value. So the values change in space, but the rate at which water is recharging the basin is a combination of precipitation and irrigation return flows. So in terms of the output, what the output from the model spits out is one lumped value that represents precipitation and irrigation return flows. So in the upcoming slide, we'll see a component of the water budget that represents these two sources of water into the basin.
This is Jim.
Yeah, please.
And I'm kind of the farmer on the board.
Sure.
Precipitation is the key thing with micro sprinklers nowadays. I forget what your return flows from irrigation, I think is the wording. Mm-hmm. That is, I would think, de minimis at best.
That's good to know. I think we'll see in the water budget as well that what's driving the rebounds is precipitation. We have wet years.
Because with nutrient management plans, mm-hmm. if we're putting water into the basin, we're not doing our nutrient management plans, and given the cost and the scarcity, I don't think, that was a real thing with furrow irrigation, which existed in this valley a couple of decades ago, but with micro sprinklers, it de minimis. A broken pipe is about the only chance you've got. So anyway,
Okay,
FYI.
that's great info as we move into the future. Okay, so the second
I know that
component-
issue, Jim. That issue came up with the model that the State Control Board. You know, their webinar, their first webinar. A couple of the ag people said that they really were using outdated parameters for the phenomena you're talking about in their modeling. That came up.
And around Sacramento, flood irrigation is still a very real thing.
Yeah.
So it does exist in some spots, rice fields, obviously, but not here.
Right. That was the point that the informed people were trying to tell them.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I'm taking notes here to see if we can potentially figure out how to adjust that for these future simulations. Because if that's the case, then we can see how we can incorporate that into the distributed parameter watershed model and see the level of effort that would be required to incorporate that.
What I would think if you knew the amount of water that was being applied and then the plant uptake, it might give you kind of a range of water that's being consumed and maybe not being consumed.
I think that's that. So I will be totally upfront. I think that's how the distributed parameter watershed model calculates that.
Okay.
How we then adjust that, though, I'm going to have to go into their manual and into the input files and see how exactly we might change that so that we're essentially representing increased irrigation efficiencies, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So that's something we can do. We can take a look at moving forward, definitely. Okay, so the second component of inflows, mountain front recharge, again, that's calculated by the distributed parameter watershed model input used as an input into the basin, into the groundwater model, and that's its own separate thing, so we can directly extract that from the model outputs and estimate how much mountain front recharge is contributing to inflows to the basin over time. And the kind of last component of inflows is we have the historical spreading at the San Antonio Creek spreading grounds. Then we have septic system discharges and wastewater treatment discharges at the Thatcher School. In terms of outflows,
I don't believe the spreading grounds has ever been in operation since it
I
was
think the model has it until 1985.
Right.
but it's not in operation. It's never been in operation, really.
Oh, it was from 1947 to 85, I believe.
Oh, okay,
Yes,
I was thinking
it used to.
post 85. Okay.
Yeah, and post 85, the spreadings turned off. But in that period up to 1985, they account for spreading. And then after the 85 period, they're not recharging the basin anymore with those grounds. In terms of outflows, we have groundwater extractions which are explicitly specified. We can pull those from the model. As we discussed, I think maybe last time around, and then with a colleague of mine, Dan, discussed how the model represents groundwater surface water interactions. The model calculates discharges to streams, and we'll look at the contribution of that to the overall water budget. And we presume that all of those discharges are occurring along the San Antonio Creek. And then again, what the model implicitly calculates are underflows to the Upper Ventura River subbasin. We can directly extract those. And then evapotranspiration is specified in the model as well. We sum those different inflows and outflows. We take the difference between those and get an annual estimate of groundwater change in storage. And then we can aggregate that to put together that cumulative change in storage curve that we showed in the last slide. So what does that look like in terms of the actual water budget that we would be presenting for the GSP? The figure on the right represents kind of the annual volumetric changes of each of those components over time. So here I'm showing, I think we have 7 different components. We have in the light blue, I guess let me take one step back. The y-axis here represents the volumetric change, or volumetric flow rate of each component into or out of the basin in any given water year. Volumes that are less than 0 represent a discharge or outflow from the basin. Volumes that are greater than 0 represent some inflow to the basin. The black line, black marker symbols with the black line, again represents that cumulative change in storage curve that I showed a few slides ago with the groundwater elevations. And we've broken up the total inflows and outflows in any given water year into the different components that we can extract from the groundwater model itself. So here we've got the groundwater inflows broken up into the components of irrigation return flows and precipitation recharge, which is shown here in blue. And again, as I was discussing, I guess one other piece, there's a lot of information in the slide. Behind the bar chart represents the different water year types. So we have dry water years in this light pink color, wet water years in this light blue, and where we're missing color, that would be considered a normal water year. So here what we're seeing is a precipitation recharge in these wet water years really increases. We have these big flows of precipitation recharge that are entering the groundwater basin. And interestingly, in those big precipitation years, we get large discharges to groundwater streams as well. So this blue, this kind of darker blue portion here represents the model estimates of groundwater discharges to streams. So specifically, if we look at 1978, we have a wet water year. We have around 18,000 or so acre feet of precipitation recharging the basin. And then we have around, I don't know the exact number here, but maybe 10,000 acre feet or so discharging to streams. So what the model is telling us is that during these wet water years, there's a ton of water moving into the basin, but there's also a lot of water moving out through discharging to the San Antonio Creek. What that's doing in terms of the cumulative change in storage is that, as we saw and as was reflected in the groundwater elevations, a cumulative change in storage is driven by climatic variability. We have wet water years where the cumulative change in storage curve pops up. As we move into the more recent drought period, where we're in a prolonged drying, what is this, an 8-year or 6-year drought, we have a large decline in groundwater and storage that's driven by limited precipitation recharge. So this would be the type of material that would be presented in the GSP. We can break down each of these components, represent average annual flows of each component into and out of the basin, and then we'll discuss the water year dependence on this as well. So in wet water years, what are the average volumes of precipitation recharge that the basin gets? In dry water years, what is that? And how do they compare over time?
Trevor, could you go back to that just for a second?
Please.
I think it's interesting that the pumping, for the most part, was pretty consistent up until about 2015, the extractions. And then you certainly see changes, certainly in the basin drawdown, but as well as the discharge to the streams. Mm-hmm. But I think this endpoint, this far right part of the graph, I think is going to be an issue that we're going to need to make sure we explain really well, because I could see the city saying, well, you're not giving us our water in the stream, and the environmentalists are saying we're not getting enough for habitat, and so you got to cut back on pumping. But the reality is the basin did cut back on pumping.
Yeah,
you know?
I think that's right. And I think we see that in the groundwater elevations, right? Yeah. The reduction in pumping has resulted in increased groundwater elevations, and the model tells us it has resulted in an increased volume in storage.
I mean, my first year at OBGMA, the pumpers were pumping over 5,000 acre feet, and I think we had asked for about a 10% voluntary reduction. And the following year, there was about 3,500 acre feet pumped. But certainly I'm sure that was a combination of pumpers reducing, plus the shape of the basin. There are some pumpers on the periphery that lose water supply to their wells.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So on that note of pumping, one of the pieces that I discussed was this understanding of 15 acre feet per year loss of storage as well within the model uncertainty. One of the things one of the components of the model that is really kind of informing that uncertainty is its representation of pumping. So the model was developed, believe, correct me if I'm wrong, 2011 was when the original model was developed. During that period, DBS&A used reported extractions where available. Prior to, I guess, one step back, the graph on the right shows a comparison of reported and modeled groundwater extractions. We have the reported extractions shown here in this black line and the modeled pumping rates shown here in blue. As I was mentioning, prior to 1993, DBS&A estimated pumping differently than, or I guess prior to 1996, excuse me, estimated pumping differently than the GMA had estimated. DBS&A estimated pumping at an individual well by applying the average quarterly production rate from their measurement record backwards in time and assuming, they believe they assumed some fractional pumping reduction during that period, whereas GMA estimated pumping using land use and crop type information. So we have prior to 1996, there's this difference in pumping. And then as we move forward in time, and what that results in is the model is pumping less than the GMA is estimated. As we move forward in time, the trends are relatively consistent. The model does a pretty good job of capturing what's going on in terms of reported pumping, but there are years where the pumping is different, right? If we look at 2014, the modeled extractions are about 1,500, 1,200 acre feet per year higher than the GMA reporting. Conversely, in water year 2001, the model's extracting a little less than 1,000 acre feet than what has been estimated in GMA reporting.
I'm wondering if that increase in pumping was a result of maybe in 2014, that's when Casitas, I think, started ratcheting down on their conservation measures. And therefore, if people had wells, they could certainly pump those a lot more if they needed to.
Are you talking right here in 2014?
Yeah.
So I think that would make sense if we saw it reversed, where the GMA was reporting increased pumping and the model was underestimating. But here, the GMA is estimating right around 3,800, 3,500 acre feet of pumping in water year 2014, and the model's simulating around 6,000 acre feet.
Oh, okay, gotcha. It's a simulation.
Yeah. The blue is the simulation.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So what that means in terms of the long-term record in the model is that over that 50-year period, or I guess in the same period that the GMA is recorded or reported pumping, between 1985 and 2018, the GMA is estimated around 4,900 acre feet per year of extractions from the basin. Over that same period, the model is estimating around 4,100 acre feet per year of extraction. So there's a little bit of a difference there. And I think that, again, over the period where the DBS&A wasn't estimating pumping differently than the GMA, does a pretty good job of reflecting conditions and pumping rates in the basin. There are years where it's off a little bit, but overall, it's capturing the trends. When we talk about uncertainty, moving forward, we have around, and when we talk about the sustainable yield as well, we have to recognize we're looking at around 800 acre foot per year difference in the pumping rate. So what are we looking at in terms of what the model is telling us in terms of that balance? Again, keeping in mind that pumping in the models potentially around 800 acre feet per year different than the reported. When we look at average annual inflows to the basin, here with this pie chart on the left, where the basin is being recharged at an average rate of around 8,700 acre feet per year. Again, the majority of that is occurring in the form of precipitation and irrigation return flows. The second largest component is mountain front recharge, and then to a much smaller extent, septic system discharges at the Thatcher School, and the historical operations of the San Antonio Creek spreading ground. Again, these three different sources recharge the basin at around 8,700 acre feet per year. What's the model telling us in terms of annual outflows from the basin? Again, when we talk about the basin being in balance, the model telling us that the basin's in balance. The model's simulating around 8,700 acre feet per year of outflows from the basin. The largest component of that is actually discharges to the San Antonio Creek. The model's predicting that around 4,300 acre feet per year is discharging to the San Antonio Creek. Again, as we saw on that bar chart, this average is driven really in those wet years where we have pretty large volumes of flows in the creek that are driven by discharges of groundwater that's pulling this average up. Pumping, again, is around 4,100 acre feet per year with a much lesser extent ET, and then this little purple sliver should be connected to this label, which is the underflows to the upper Ventura subbasin.
And this was the issue. We were trying to, in our alternative submitted to DWR, saying the basin was in balance, and they didn't believe it. And they've certainly classified the basin as a high priority. But if this scenario holds true, I'm not so sure it should be classified that way again.
I'm not familiar with the reprioritization and reclassification, but what the model's telling us is that, again, the modeled pumping rate of 4,100 acre feet per year is pretty sustainable, right? You have water levels that are rebounding. You have a cumulative change in storage that's more or less gotten back to its original state in 1971. It's indicating that historical operations and use of groundwater is sustainable in the basin.
Okay.
Trevor,
Yes.
on the annual average annual inflows, how much of that is that 6,400 acre feet? How much of that is going to be affected if, let's say, Casitas gives us a pretty significant cutback? How many thousand acre feet of water are we getting out of Casitas annually? Because again, we're bringing water in, the water's percolating. Got the rain, the water's percolating. We're pumping, the water's coming up, and the water's percolating. So we have three different sources of percolating water. I'm just wondering what we think happens if we, down the road, get this adjudication, we get a cutback, and we have some other issues. What kind of numbers can we expect?
In terms of actual numbers, I don't know. But when I think about the problem conceptually, unless there's a change in land use type, I don't imagine this number is going to change, right? What might change is that we start pumping more to meet the irrigation demands. So we might expect that the irrigation return flows and precipitation recharge fixed by climate and land use type, right? But the basin's going to be stressed at a higher rate because we're now pumping more water to meet the demands of agriculture, right? So it's hard to say how the numbers exactly are going to change, but it's something I think that as we move into the next slides and talk about the proposed projected scenarios that we should consider, because what we're proposing right now, as I'll discuss, is really operating the basin at this 4,100 acre feet per year. And the big underlying assumption in that is that surface water imports are available over the next 50 years. And that's from our end, it's an assumption, and I would like your input on whether or not that assumption is reasonable or not moving into the future, and how we account for that then if it's not.
Trevor, this is Peter Candy. I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
With regard to your pie chart here, groundwater discharges to San Antonio Creek, I'm not seeing anything that attempts to deal with the issue and what we believe is going on. The reality that these discharges to San Antonio Creek are really surface water discharges, and it's not discharges from the groundwater, the deeper groundwater aquifer. And this suggests that, it doesn't try to attempt to deal with that issue in any way, and suggests that maybe those discharges are coming from the deeper aquifer. So I just wanted to point that out and see if you had any thoughts in that regard.
I'm not sure. I definitely will say the way we're presenting and analyzing the results now, it doesn't get at that. And what I'm not sure of is if the model will be able to tell us that. Because essentially right now the model's broken up into 10 layers, and I need to review the hydrogeologic conceptual model that went into developing this. But all of those discharges, I believe, are happening in that first model layer. So if that first model layer is representing the principal aquifer or a portion of the principal aquifer, then we're not going to be able to separate whether or not this discharge is coming from perched conditions or the principal aquifer itself.
Well, is that the kind of thing that the updated information from this monitoring well might help calibrate better that particular issue?
I think field measurements would definitely help inform how we interpret these results. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can jump in there real quick, Trevor. I appreciate that. I mean, certainly this appears to be balanced, but the half the pie on the right is groundwater discharge to San Antonio Creek at 43,000 acre feet per year, and this year, for example, we're getting a tenth of that, and that's almost all from the perch system. Now, we don't have the data to the degree of temporal or spatial resolution that we do today, but 2005, for example, classically during the rehabilitation of the spreading grounds, scoping and early stages of planning and grant funding, we invited a few folks from Fish and Game and NOAA nymphs out to see this project, and we hiked along San Antonio Creek, dry as a bone. 2005, one of the wettest years ever, wells flowing artesian still within the basin, and downstream, the same kind of flows that we see today. That's it, maybe a little more, but we don't have the data. We weren't collecting it on a monthly basis like we do now, nor the temporal resolution that we have in the basin water levels. We hadn't set that all up yet, but conceptually, it really does seem very high to have that much groundwater per se, especially from the principal aquifer, discharging in San Antonio Creek at that rate. I'd suspect that the model probably has a very shallow component, or is accounting for this in some way as what we would consider surface flow from headwaters to the ocean, as opposed to having any reasonable or lengthy storage period in the basin.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I will say the developers kind of acknowledge this is one of the challenges with developing and using the distributed parameter watershed model is the lack of ability to calibrate it, right? There aren't stream flow measurements, or there were not stream flow measurements available during the development of the model that could really help constrain how the model was representing inflows, or really the entire surface water process in the contributing watershed. So this is what the model is telling us in terms of what's coming out of the basin for discharges, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the final answer in terms of how surface water and groundwater interact in the basin and where this water comes from. I think that, again, I would encourage always, as someone who plays with models and builds models, that more data is better, especially with something as dynamic as surface water groundwater interactions. But as far as where the model's at now, this is what the model is telling us is coming out of the basin in terms of surface water flows. And when we go back to Jordan, just to kind of key on what you're talking about, in those really dry years, the model's telling us that there's very little flows that are discharging, or very little groundwater that's discharging to stream. So that average is driven by these really wet years where we have a lot of precipitation recharge that then is making its way back out of the basin in terms of discharges to streams. So it's a very, I would say, a dynamic process that can be, our understanding of it can be refined throughout the implementation process for the GSP.
Yeah, and I think that's important, both in the GSP refinement as a planning document itself, but also in implementation. It speaks to the importance of this continued high resolution and temporal data collection that we're doing. It really to demonstrate this and get a better handle on anchoring this model in reality.
Yeah,
so, I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely.
Trevor, another quick question. Once these parameters are, we have confidence in their calibration in this distributed model, would it be able to reasonably evaluate certain changes in the parameters or whether certain issues. I'm getting back to the spreading grounds. Right now, that permit has an artificially low limit of the maximum amount of recharge, even if it was in operation. But so, in other words, we'd be able to at least have some inference as to if it was put back into operation and if that artificial top limit was raised, what effect this might have on the overall water budget. This might be a tool for that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that we could even do that with this model, right? Because what we'd be assessing is the change that project or management action has on the predicted level. So we can assess changes when we change parameters or introduce different sources of water. The model is definitely going to be able to tell us how that impacts operations and conditions in the basin.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Trevor, aren't we seeing that in the model results pre-1985? And that
I have not done a deep dive enough to really understand how what that spreading is. See these little purple slivers? They're a little bit thicker at the beginning of the simulation compared to the end.
right,
That's the influence of the spreading.
right.
So it's a small component. I think they estimated around 500 acre feet per year in the pre-1985 conditions. It's a small component relative to when we look at precipitation recharge, where it's an order of magnitude larger.
It wasn't one of the purposes of the rehabilitation was to increase that capacity that's never been utilized.
Oh, okay. And so then we could assess how that might impact.
And I believe the city of Ventura put an artificial limit on it of 1,000 max,
Okay.
which really was more of a, I think based on faulty assumptions of the relationship between I don't think it recognizes what I'm trying to say, the difference between perched and production aquifer and discharge. In my opinion, I could be wrong. Jordan could disabuse me of that notion if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic at the time that when we were going through the design of the San Antonio Creek Spreading Grounds Rehabilitation Project, the idea of the perched aquifer was not yet nascent, and its importance in the system. So, frankly, a selling point of the Spreading Grounds project was, hey, there's going to be a downstream benefit in flattening the curve or flattening out or extending the receding limb of the hydrograph, especially during dry years. By spreading in the spring, you have more flows in the summer and fall in San Antonio Creek. Now, that of course seems to be contradictory to the idea of spreading grounds rehabilitation recharges the production aquifers primarily, and the discharge of San Antonio Creek is occurring primarily from very shallow aquifers, mostly underneath the city. So to then wrangle that to a more true to life benefit for everybody would be, let's do the recharge projects within the city over the perched aquifer, a shorter residence time of water, but primarily for the in-stream flow benefit. And that's what the Watershed Progressive Group and the city are working in earnest. So it's really, it takes a village here, and it's nice to look at these numbers and see that conceptualization in a quantitative format that hopefully the DWR buys off on and sees the balance and sustainability of this basin.
Chair, I'm not sure who to direct this to, but is the recharge mechanism fully operational, ready to go now, which is one question. And the number that I had that I thought Ventura limited us to was 500 acre feet a year.
I thought it was 1,000.
Well, maybe we need to run that down. I mean, we have in our own archives, I've had to argue too many times, from 47 to 85, they recharged approximately 10,000 acre feet of water. That's about 250 acre feet a year. So, I don't know that they're going to give us 4 times that
I'm
amount.
talking about
but
the new permit. I thought it was 1,000, but I could be wrong.
yeah, I kind of think
Well,
it's 500, but
this is Jim, and I'll speak to both. Well, I'll speak mostly to the first one, the first part of your question, Bob. No, I would say it is not operational now. We've only had the one flow 2 years ago where we even got to the point where you got to where you could do the test so we could submit the letter. And it's the engineering on it is such that without a lot of kind of what I'd call garage mechanic type shade tree engineering, it's going to be very hard to operate as it was built, with the fish screens and waiting for that, because you can't open the valves early on and get water flowing. You've got to wait until you get up to that point, at which time you've built sediment. So it is a very faulty or challenged design, I would say. And then, so with those two things said, it's almost a moot issue arguing over 500 or 1,000. I think we'd be lucky to get 100 into it in a year after messing with the screens and trying to keep them going.
Jim, where I'm trying to go to is the model helped to justify an investment in updating that engineering to make it more useful during,
well,
that's all.
The model helped to justify why it was there. It didn't. The engineering, I think, is all driven by the fish screens.
Yeah, but the whole. Yeah, I'm sorry.
What fish?
The fish. Well, the screens and the fish. And then it might, Ventura's might have been coyote smart in making it, pushing designs that make it unoperable.
Right. I mean, the idea of using sediment to clear sediment, using sediment-laden water to clear sediment was a kind of a basic flaw.
Right. No.
I'm just thinking about the potential. We could, obviously something needs to be, it'd be nice to know what the payoff to fixing that would be. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No. And yeah, it probably, a few hundred acre feet. And then you have to throw in, and these guys could look at the graph and, it's that a few hundred acre feet every 4th year that you might get to. So, averages to 75 or something.
Yeah. Okay.
And, Ojai Water Conservation District, we're not going to accept it. The county would like to hand it over to us. But our basic position is we're not going to accept something until you show us it works. Because it has, weed abatement, ongoing issues and stuff. And Glenn Shepard at the county, it's definitely a back burner item for him, and we harass him. But we can only get to those. We only get to those spots where we can even shade tree engineer it. Never got to it this year. You've got to get the right flow rates going to where you can even try.
Right. That's probably a proper expression of exasperation about this whole situation.
Yeah. So.
Well, thank you, Jim. As disappointing as that information is, I thought, they've had enough years to try to figure it out, but.
All righty. Shall we move on to the next steps for the
Please.
GSP? Okay. So that was a presentation of the historical and what we're going to call the historical and current conditions water budget. So what Sigma requires is that we present water budgets for 3 different periods. One is the historical period, one are current conditions, and then projected conditions. So that 1971 to 2019 is going to represent the historical and current conditions in the basin. What we then need to develop are projected water budgets for the basin, and that per Sigma's regulations needs to include a 50-year projection horizon where we incorporate some historical record of climate, we assess the impacts of climate change, and then we incorporate projected water demands into the simulation process as well. So, and they have, again, specific requirements and how we are to incorporate recent land use, ET, crop coefficients, and projected surface water supplies. So that gets back to the question of what happens if surface water supplies decrease here. How do we, what do we expect in regards to surface water supplies? And if surface water supplies decrease, how do we expect groundwater usage to change? And how do we represent that in our projection simulations? So we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. And then, as I mentioned, in this part of the discussion, we really would welcome input and feedback into what we're suggesting for the projection simulations.
Casitas is preparing its urban water management plan right now.
Okay.
And it has a revised safe yield and revised projected demands through 2040. So you can probably use those numbers.
Okay. We can take a look at those. If I don't know if they're in a state where they could be shared with us, so we could incorporate them into our projection simulations yet.
There was a draft presented at a public board meeting, so I'm sure you can.
Perfect. We can pull that report and look at those projections. And maybe before we get there, we'll take a brief stop at the projected climate conditions that we're considering incorporating for the 50-year projection planning and implementation horizon. So again, like I mentioned, the historical and current is 1971 to 2019. Then our plan is to take the end of that simulation and tack 50 years onto that. So it would then be the projection simulation would be water year 2020 through 2070. The hydrology that we're proposing to use for that 50-year period is the 1945 to 1995 hydrology. So here, the figure on the right is showing precipitation measured during that period. We have the blue bars representing annual precipitation in each water year, where precipitation was measured at the NOAA station located in Ojai. And we have cumulative departure from mean shown here with this black curve with these gold markers. This highlighted region is the characteristics or the hydrology that we're proposing to use for the projected simulation. And what we're essentially what we're saying is if we start with this 1945 condition, we're going to take the 2019 water year and tack on an extended dry period. So it's about a 20-year drying period from 1945 through 1965-ish. The thought there is that this is maybe a more conservative climate assessment as we look into managing and using groundwater moving into the future. We're going to start the model by running it into a drier period, and then it's going to be followed by, following this 1960 to 1995, a relatively wet period, and then another relatively dry period. So in terms of quantitative numbers, the long-term average precipitation volume measured at this Ojai station is about 20.6 inches, and that's from data collected from 1901 through 2019. The 1945 to 1995 hydrology is right there in terms of average annual precipitation. The 50-year average during that period is 20.5 inches. Where the difference is in how that average annual precipitation is distributed throughout time. And the way that we can describe that is by breaking this climate period into wet, normal, and dry water years, and we can compare those to the long-term historical record. So here we've got on the y-axis is frequency, so we can think about the frequency as the percentage of total years that are characterized as dry, normal, and wet. In the long-term record from 1901 to 2019, about 40% of the years are dry, a little under 50% are normal, and then a little over 10% are wet. In this 1945 to 1995 period, we have a little higher frequency of dry water years, a little lower frequency of normal, and a little higher frequency of wet. So we're essentially taking that 20.5 inches and moving it a little bit to the opposite ends of the spectrum. We're going to have a little bit drier, prolonged dry period. We're going to have a little bit longer, prolonged wet period. But over the 50-year average, we're going to be providing around the long-term average annual precipitation that's been measured in the basin. So this would be the kind of what we're going to call the baseline simulation.
Could I ask a question?
By all means, yeah.
I've always, and I forget what the exact number was, but I always thought we were more in the 15, 16 average inches. And the way we got there was obviously spikes and the dry years. I've never heard a 20 average. Is it? Jordan?
I don't know if Jordan has, but I have. I've looked at.
Yeah, I mean, we've often said it was around 21 and a quarter over the 1940s to more recently. You expand that out at plus or minus an inch here and there, I think is
yeah. Okay, my memory is just wrong. All right, thank you.
I think, Jim, if you use Casitas Dam site, it is around 15, but up in the valley it's 20.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so again, the way that this would be implemented would be, as I'm going to discuss in 2 slides, it would be the first of 3 projections that we would be making. And that first baseline projection would be to take that historical model that was developed for the 1971 to 2019 and tack on this hydrology. And we'd simulate that hydrology with a distributed parameter watershed model. We'd pull out the irrigation and precipitation return flows and use those as inputs into the groundwater model for projection simulation. The second component of the projection conditions, again, is the water demand. So how is groundwater going to be used moving into the future? What we're proposing right now is to use that long-term average pumping rate of 4,100 acre-feet per year. As we've seen from the historical water budgets and as we've seen from groundwater elevations, at that modeled rate of 4,100 acre-feet per year, the basin is responding and rebounding in wet periods. It's declining in dry periods, but it's seen a long-term no net change in storage over the long-term historical record. So what we're proposing again is for that baseline simulation to operate conditions in the basin, to pump the basin at 4,100 acre-feet per year. Again, that as we briefly touched on, that really assumes that surface water supplies are available, and we'll look at that draft urban water management plan to assess those assumptions. And then I guess the input that I would solicit here is if those assumptions are wrong, should we assume that the remaining demands are made up by pumping, right? So if surface water supplies are decreasing and are not available, do we linearly make that up by taking the piece of pie that's supplied by surface water and moving it over to groundwater and increase pumping accordingly? Again, that's a hypothetical because I haven't looked at the urban water management plan to see what the projection of surface water supplies are. So to wrap this all up, and again, by all means, if any of this seems wild, let us know and we will adjust accordingly. But we're going to run 3 simulations to meet those GSP and SGMA requirements. We're going to run a future baseline simulation where we take that 1945 to 1995 hydrology, we tack it on to the end of the historical period, and then we run the distributed parameter watershed model to generate estimates of recharge. We then feed that into the groundwater model where we will run a simulation from 1971 through 2070 where the last 50 years, the basin is pumped at a constant rate of 4,100 acre-feet per year. To meet the requirements of assessing the potential impacts of climate change, we would take that 1945 to 1995 hydrology and apply DWR's 2030 and 2070 central tendency climate change factors. So those are climate change factors that DWR provides to anyone who's developing, to the public. We can apply them directly to precipitation, and it scales precipitation in any given month to reflect potential changes that climate change might have on climate patterns moving into the future. So these are the 3 projection simulations we're proposing. If these sound okay, we can move forward with developing the simulations and developing those same bar charts and cumulative change in storage charts to help characterize and characterize potential conditions in the basin moving forward, and to meet those requirements that the SGMA regulations have for the GSP development. And that is the end of the slide deck. And if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. If there's any comments or feedback on the proposed simulations, we also would really welcome that as well.
I have a question on the issue of whether or not there's enough surface water available to supplement supply. I mean, the reality is there's less surface water than there was 20 years ago. There's less groundwater probably than we thought there was 20 years ago. So we have a limited supply, so there really isn't a choice. We can't overdraft one or the other. So it's going to have to be balanced. I mean, we have some access. Casitas has access potentially to some state water, but that's a limited supply as well. So, and the reality is we can't exceed that.
Yeah, and I think that would be, potentially if we were to say take the deficit in surface water supply and transfer it over to groundwater pumping, what we might expect to see in simulation results would be groundwater levels to decline. And that would suggest that some type of management action needs to be implemented to address that, right? I think that's a very real and relevant point that either can be addressed in the assumptions of how we develop the model, or in how we interpret the model results if we incorporating increased pumping to meet irrigation requirements.
I think the 4,100 acre feet, if we're going to expect that on the long term, certainly you're going to have high and low and averages, a lot of factors. But I think based upon at least my few years that I've been working with OBGMA, there's probably going to have to be some limitations set on pumpers to get to that level. And then maybe in the wet years, you could allocate a little more water to people, and in the dry years, you have to allocate less. It's a lot more work, but if you're trying to keep the basin reasonably balanced, and Jordan and I have talked before, you still have to, there's going to be drawdown periods, there's going to be fill up periods. And so we got to try and determine, well, how far are we willing to draw down before we really ratchet down, those kind of things. But if we have good wet years, and maybe there's an opportunity for people to have more water.
Yeah, and I guess to prevent it from getting too complicated,
yeah,
Casitas's projections aren't that dire. So, if you look at, we've had the same issues with Casitas water use in the early years. There was a lot more water used than there is today. So, the reduction in Casitas's yield and projected demands isn't really that much different than what we've been living with for the past 10 years.
Yeah.
So I think I'm not suggesting that it's going to be that dire and it's going to be imbalanced. It's just that regardless, there is a limit.
Yeah. And so I assume that when and if surface water from outside the watershed becomes available, it could just be treated that way in terms of adjusting the model. I'm talking about the 2 proposed pipeline connections that are being looked at now. And that's just basically surface water from outside the watershed.
I think the way that it would get incorporated, I think we would need some thought, right? Because the model right now doesn't explicitly take into account surface water deliveries, right? It will take into account irrigation requirements. It will take into account pumping. And when additional surface water is brought in, that needs to get distributed throughout to the model kind of before running the model. So how it gets incorporated, I think will take a little bit of thought to really account for where the water is going to end up going, how it's going to offset demands a little bit. So it can by all means be incorporated, but it will take a little bit of work to do so.
Well, we're still a ways out.
Yeah, fair.
The other thought is, Jim kind of alluded to earlier, agriculture, I think, is going to be looking more and more to be as sufficient as possible over time. And I mean, at some point, there's going to be demand hardening. People just can't cut back anymore. So it's either a function of we've got the ag at the certain level we've got now, it doesn't grow, or ag just kind of, some of it goes away over time. That certainly can have an influence on demands as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other element is that a large portion of the usage on the basin is for urban use. So, and that, the city of Ojai has two sources of water, as groundwater and Lake Casitas water. So, one of the reasons the basin is considered critical is because it serves a large urban use. And since the urban users have an alternate supply, it should temper that a little bit. I mean, it's a lot easier to manage that than it is an agricultural operation that might not have that connection to the surface water.
Right. And Richard, I was only bringing up this conceptual issue of how to incorporate surface water deliveries, because we are talking about a 50-year simulation, and I guess I'm hoping that we'll actually get something completed.
Well, the urban water management plan, the draft addresses that.
Okay.
So I think that'll help DUDAC deal with that issue. At least they'll give them a reference.
Yeah. Sure.
Well,
And
in
of course,
terms of
that depends on precipitation up on the reservoirs, which I mean, it's all water from the sky, one way or another.
Yeah.
In terms of demand hardening, does the GMA have any information on what percentage of pumpers may be on micro sprinklers or particular operations that could see improved irrigation efficiency?
I don't think OBGMA has a lot of that information. It's probably more observation. Jim may know, Jordan may have some idea, but
I would say 100% are, I don't know of one person who isn't on a micro sprinkler or a drip.
Right.
It 2 droughts later, we've all done everything that technology allows.
Right.
So demand hardening, you're at a steady state if the acreage stays steady.
right.
And economics will drive that.
Right. And the real order of magnitude for urban gray water improvements and stuff like that, it's just not a big enough number to matter from what I've seen, really, in the long run.
No, I don't either. I think we have, there's not a lot of room left, other than what Jim alludes to, and that's, you take stuff out of production. So, and I think that really depends on how long the drought lasts and the cost. So we saw some of that in the last drought. I mean, there's properties that basically were fallowed, probably because they had old orchards, but those are being replanted now. So we're going to see an increase in demand probably over the next 5 years. But that kind of cycle happens.
Aside from the cost and, you know, the quantity of water to be developed out of recycled, I had discussions with Ojai Valley Sand a while ago, and their attitude is, well, we're not going to build it. If somebody else wants to build it, fine. But you know, I don't think the economics are there, quite frankly, at this point.
And do you see any potential long-term trend toward using less water-intensive crops in the basin? Is there any potential for that?
The only potential there, it would be grapes.
Right.
And given Pierce's disease with the sharpshooter presence, it's just hard to do. If the UC system develops a grapevine that's resistant to Pierce's disease, there's a very real potential, and then that could cut 40 to 50%. But then you end up with wineries that have to wash stuff off, and you probably use just as much water.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, Trevor, Trey, Peter Candy again. Listen, just a question for you. Try to put this in CEQA terminology. It's not CEQA, I apologize. SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So are we looking, based on these water budget numbers, at a sustainable yield of 4,100 acre feet per year? Is that really what we're talking about here? It sounds like you guys have done some work to come up with that number in round terms, and you're planning to do some additional work to support that number. I mean, I'm just trying to back up and take a broad view look at what's going on here, and just understanding, you know, what the implications might be for the agency. You know, if that's where you end up at 4,100 acre feet, that's a sustainable yield. That's going to have implications.
Yeah, I can let Trevor weigh in too, but I think that number is really seen as the traditional safe yield that you would see in basin adjudications that don't necessarily take into account all of the potential undesirable results in the basin. And that's why we're going over each of the 6 sustainability indicators. I think we've already shown that land subsidence and seawater intrusion are not impacting the basin. So those would not be criteria that impact the ultimate sustainable yield. If we have time today, we do have another 12 slides to go over groundwater dependent ecosystems, and most likely that would be the largest driver to any reduction in the safe yield. I think with our initial findings, you'll see there's a lot of data gaps still, and that likely a lot of that will be pushed out to future updates over SGMA implementation. But I think it's safe to say that probably, around 4,000, 4,100 acre feet is going to be at or near some sort of sustainable yield. There could, as we mentioned earlier in the meeting, there's some pumpers that, have reduced production during these dry periods and reduce groundwater storage in the basin. So it's really up to the locals to define whether or not that's an undesirable result. Basin-wide, a reduction in production from certain wells could locally be decided, well, that's just how the basin's going to be operated. We're going to have to, in order to maximize our water use to meet water demand in dry periods, allow the basin to decline. So SGMA does allow for that. And I think that's something where the stakeholders just really need to weigh in and voice that's something that the locals desire.
Trevor, just for everybody's information, the city has an Arts Commission meeting at 5 o'clock. And so we're going to need to be off a few minutes early before that. So I don't know how long your slides are going to take.
I was going to ask the board if you're interested in going through the rest of this, or if you'd like to absorb what we've learned today. We could have another meeting in the middle of this month. There's an awful lot of stuff all at once, and it may give Dudek time to do some more work on the model.
So my only comment is, what about the deadline that we're facing, the Sigma deadline? How are we going at a pace such that we're going to make our timelines?
Yes, I think we're all right on the deadline. I think what I'm going to recommend is that we release chapters independently, not the entire GSP at once, to at least the board to review. We do have pretty much chapters 1 and 2 written and all the figures done for those chapters. Trevor's updating the water budget in chapter 2. He's got most of that done based on these new results. So I would expect for the next board meeting, we could release those to OBGMA staff to review first and make sure those are good to go to board members. But I think what we're going to have to do, just to make sure we meet this January 2022 deadline, is have some of these chapters reviewed while we're working on chapters 3, 4, and 5. But now that we've got the water budget figured out, I think we can go ahead and knock out chapter 3 pretty quickly. And then at some point we need to get into potential projects and management actions and implementation. But it seems like there's a short list probably of projects we need to look at. And I'm not expecting that's going to take a whole lot of amount of time, but we certainly want to get stakeholder input on any projects.
Well, and that stakeholder input is one of the pieces. Aside from Dudek getting their work done, we have to have a public outreach effort. And,
right.
That's going to at least be 3 or 4 meetings and get the same information out to the public so they can review it and comment.
No, that's the part. That's where the time gets crunched.
Yeah.
It's already basically the 6th month. 3 or 4 meetings is, call that 4 months. You're at the 10th month of the year at that point. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure that we've got to give this up, but I think we've got to maybe schedule something mid-time so that we can get through this, so we can get these things out, so we can do the public comment, at least have the ability.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. I mean, we have solved one of the biggest problems, so we should be able to make a little more progress.
The only thing I'd ask, because I think when we go to this is, Santa Paula Basin, it runs on a 3-year rolling average. I'm wondering if you could do the revised model and also have a 3-year average line thrown in there that would smooth, and we'd see how it would affect a 3-year rolling average on the revised assessment model water budget.
Yeah, we can do that. So you're talking about something like this, but in addition to the cumulative, like maybe a 3-year rolling average for recharge and outflows.
I think it's the black line. It's too small for me to read the fine print, but I think that would be the one that you'd do on the 3-year rolling average.
Yeah, we can do that. Definitely. Absolutely.
So Trey, this is Bob Daddy. How far out are you from releasing 1 and 2? If we all look at it, we can all help proofread it, and we can have a discussion, and we can clean this thing up. I'm for really putting this thing on a pair of rockets and moving along as quickly as possible, and as quickly as you get them, give them to us. We can take notes, we can look at them, we can question, we can discuss, we can send things in for clarification, and we can help you on the end. So when we do have our meetings, we move through it pretty quick, and we can close out these chapters. Anybody have a problem doing that?
And I think our staff is spread thin as it is. So I think it falls heavily to the directors also. So I would concur with Bob. Send it out to all of us.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think assuming John and Jordan concur, I don't think we'd have any issue releasing chapters 1 and 2 in the next 2 weeks here. They're in pretty good shape. The only thing in chapter 1 is, there's some findings in chapter 3 that will have to be added later. But other than that, they're pretty much ready to go. We might have to update some stuff about the ongoing basin-wide kind of Ventura adjudication, but other than that, I think they're in pretty good shape.
Yeah, Trevor, if you get it to me, or Trey, you get it to me, I'll get it out.
Okay, will do.
Yeah, if we get,
then
the
Richard, well, go ahead. Well, we've been through this public water circus. We went through it for 8 years with Flow. What I would like to know is what is the shortest amount of time that we can have between meetings? I would request that once we get into the public, that we can do some things, and 1 a week or even twice a week, and move this thing through, because here's what's going to happen. You're going to have the same 5 or 10 people. That's going to be it for all of the things. It's going to be the same questions, the same issues. We are not going to have buy-in. We never have buy-in. We're just not going to have a lot of people here that are going to look at this thing. And so I really don't want to extend it out over a long period of time, because we're looking at 45 to 95, for Christ's sake. This is not new news, and this isn't anything that's going to change tomorrow. It's there, it's done. And we got that 118-year tail on there. So I would hope that we could schedule this thing within the law and within the Ralph M. Brown Act and the public meetings and all that, with as short a turnaround cycle between meetings as possible.
Director Daddy, I'll take a look at that. Certainly, we're going to rely upon DUDEC to assist us with information, but I'll take a look at the SGMA Act and see what the requirements are for public notice. I'll put a little schedule together that we can say, based on 3 or 4 meetings, this is the shortest time we can do. And then the board can look at that and say, okay, these are the months or the weeks that we want to do that. And so I'll put that together.
I would really rather have hey, here's your notification, and this is a 1 month calendar, and these are the 4 meetings we're having in that 1 month, and just throw that calendar out.
Yeah, I'm just not sure if we have to publish in the newspaper, but I'll look at all that and I'll get it out to you.
John, I'll help you out. I own the newspaper. I'll be more than happy to publish for us.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Well, I think from what's going on the Upper Ventura River, I think what we're going to find is the portion that we've done up till now, we don't get much comment. We don't get too much participation. What's going to happen is the next section that DUDEC wants to present, they're in their 12 slides, is going to create some interest. So I think we have to be prepared for what segments of this are going to get the most public comment, and prepare the meetings for that. Because the Upper Ventura River, I noticed what they're doing is they're doing a chapter with a board at a regular board meeting, and then they're having like a hearing 2 weeks later after the board's had a chance to make comments and do some revisions. And the initial 4 or 5 chapters, they've got no participation, but now they're starting to get quite a bit when they're talking about impacts on surface flows and ecosystems and all that sort of thing. So
okay,
I think we're getting to that point now where we're going to have to do that.
all right. Well, I think Bob's on to a good point. Just schedule. We probably have to wrap.
Yeah. I'll get a hold of all of you and find out if you want to have a meeting, the next week or 2. If DUDEC's available, I'll have to coordinate it so we can get out this ecosystem information.
Shoot for mid-June.
Mid-June?
2 weeks.
Okay.
And if they have those 2 chapters, if we get them soon enough, we may be able to review those for that as well.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Okay. Any other comments? If not, we're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.